David being obstructed in the economic arrangements in order to collapse the United States government by the disrupting creation of bubbles and bursts of bubbles inside the market specifically subverts the understanding that the protections of the market were one of the original functions which would have evolved from the general functions into the political functions after the structure of David's business empire would have been stabilized inside the United States. It would easily be accessible to the use of the political party, which then could actively use it in collaboration and acceleration of the political interests as it engages in its political brokering, power brokering, which manufactures the arrangements of the assumed political interests inside the national news and political social medias, which would have been arranged under the obstructing warrants by the Confederacy in its disruption of the market in favor of the communism of the choosing of winners and losers, as the assumption that David was not pro-white supremacist. um, he would have actively engaged in his trades in favor of preferred market arrangements, which by definition um, buy low and sell high, and the purchase low requires him to restore, repair, and validate the function of the most injured things in order to get them to the highest level, which in the systemic racism of the white supremacists creates targeted groups inside the United States which were supposed to be protected, but victimized by conspiracy against the rights to remove their rights without due process or cause, which systemically has been conducted in the war against the American population, such as the black community, who have been targeted with such statements from the judiciary by judicial activism, saying that they are undesirables and thus to be discarded as trash and inferior, and the function of actively hiring out COINTELPRO type operations in order to target their leaders and destabilize their collective communities would have generated the position of social engineering them into a state of communism without insurance, which would have actively engaged in social engineering in order to control and collapse them as a pseudo slave group operating under the false pretense by the obstructed evidence of their magic systems to engage in their fraudulent extortions, which create systemic racism throughout the system as a function of warfare by the white supremacists who are seeking the overthrow and disdain of the American government and the definition of the offices and the limitations of those offices and the removing of the limitations of those offices as a criminal act is the function of acting as an individual without a legal government. And these primary justifications as the function to have destroyed those communities which have every right to have not been disrupted, were systemically harassed under those pretenses, such as the arrangements of 1983's policy to create the crime of the conspiracy against the rights in fake experiments as a mechanism of war, as the military industrial educational complex engages in many of the manipulations, such as the depopulation programs, such as the attack against the sexuality of the population, creating population collapse, as well as the function of infecting them with various diseases without their ability to protect against, as they are systematically being harassed by the no-touch surveillance systems, similar to how the CIA used when engaging, I think it was radio waves, targeting monkeys, which killed the monkeys by targeting the brains, at which point these types of activities and their multiplicity of secret technologies used in the surveillance mechanism has been used in order to stabilize them and falsify the evidence, which generates the position of their social engineering victimization by the KKK contracts, which increases the amount of crimes that they are actively victimized by, as the crime is encouraged in order to engage in the function of the white supremacists extorting it under the black market profits, which allows them to clean out the IP functions, systemically using it for the communism in question, where the activity of committing the crime isn't normally payable by the office that they're not using, but are using as a pretense under color of office. The wages for that is replaced by the status, and the function of status is the conspiracy against the rights. So the activity of using the black market is the value of the status, which is being extorted against them as they actively distribute the criminal rackets, and the cleaning out or laundering of that status is into superior desirable contracts chosen by the communists, which allows them to take a cash payment, uh, having cleaned out their crimes from status into money under the function of the working contracts as it's stabilized in the absence of the free market in favor of maintaining their criminal racket protection schemes, where they are criminalizing evidence of their magic, where there is no remedy to a secret because the secret itself is a criminal enterprise, as the white supremacists overthrowing the United States government are perpetually operating as a hate group against the United States government. And the arrangement of this wizard communism, which David was projected to have actively opposed, would have specifically feared David's ability to engage in counterinsurgencies and other operations of intelligence oversight functions, subverting the operations of their crime where the only purpose is the crime in question, such as the false conviction racket, such as their targeting of Quest's original leader, who, having originally refused the FBI's fascism contract, received the stick of the false punishment for refusing the carrot of the fascist contract, which is systemically connected to the Twitter files, as many of those in the Twitter files had consented to the fascist contracts of the public-private partnership as they engage in criminal activities for the federal government as an extension function of the federal government, without the barring of the federal government's activity, as it is a private contract, and the private company doing the federal government's function as the white supremacist operation has the false protection for having been a private company while conducting an action of the white supremacist double agents through the espionage war to overthrow the government, as this would have systemically created a condition by which David would have actively been in contest and aggression against the double agents inside the government, using William Barr's aggression of the acceleration of corruption under Unitary Executive Theory to remove limitations of the Constitution against the federal government as the function of unifying the all powers of the government under the executive is the removal of checks and balances under the procedure which is systemically promoted by the Nazi overthrow of the United States, as these functions of specific fascism are defined as acts of treason against the United States and are the function of an enemy of the country, would be the requirement of the United States to engage in opposition against them in the use of the government to restrain them, which has been targeted, such as with David, who has been restrained under the assumption of his position in that political party, which would have systemically use the network interest, which they are undermining, in order to use the government by legal votes to stop tolerating the existence of the crimes against the population in favor of competent policies being enforced, which would have limited them to the constitutionally approved function, which would have systemically received more and more support of the targeted communities, which is a primary fear of the insurrectionists, who understand that the targeted communities are a viable voting population, and while they cannot remove them from the vote publicly on the basis of the excuses provided, they are actively subverted and undermined through the fraud against the government, where they are actively, wittingly lying about what is going on in the operations, as they use the criminal surveillance approved by judicial activists such as Brett um, Kavanaugh, who says that they can engage in the surveillance and engage in those functions of false experiments, uh, as long as it does not include the function of using it for conviction, which they specifically are, as the function does not have a restraint against it. The act of planting evidence to be found by investigators who are pointed to the planted positions generates the general corruption system, which compounds into the laundering arrangements, as the function of the false experiments to hurt the target is used as an extortion and a threat against them and their families and their various interests, and the attack against their existence and human decency, their liberty, as the surveillance is actively a subversion of the right to privacy or bodily autonomy, or to their paperwork, or to their associations, or to the religious practices, or any of the other infinite diverse qualities that were supposed to be protected, which are undermined by the simple act of not submitting what was obligated to submit to the government, when the government was supposed to restrain or oppose or investigate the function being conducted, as it is an excess to the function for the function of punishment without due process, in order to acquire a change of status and other negative effects specifically prohibited, is the primary goal of the hate group insurgency. At which point you have the criminal arrangements, which has normalized into the positions, such as the function of California having been overthrown by the Confederacy, engaging in these criminal subversion raids, which are using these false evidences that they know to be fraudulent in order to get convictions, no matter what, as a function of war. Now, the conviction without due process being a foundational quality is actively claimed by the defamation of false accusations, and guilt by accusation being the primary reliance upon the exchanges of these abuses, facilitates the fraudulent excuse for the abuses by the fake experiments as torture, which generates the general weakness against the public, as they are systemically designed for the overthrow of and the arrangement of necessary force in order to win each of the cases is the acknowledgement that the process is designed to specifically ignore due process as an arrangement, as the attack against the federal Constitution's right to due process, including the function of the criminal arrest against state lines, which includes the function of their seizure of children who are being used by the surveillance in order to make compulsory speech out of them, such as the claim that they are transsexual or gay, which can be used in order to make them look trans, which creates the false assertion of identity, which facilitates their capacity to engage in the neutering of their transition, which generates the position of the statist argument that if you are a statist, then you agree that the sexuality and body does not belong to you, it belongs to the state as a fascist arrangement, is the acknowledgement that all statists are fundamentally transgender. as a matter of precedent because it is the desired outcome for the arrangement, including the function of the population control operation, which is cleaned by false tolerance for the arrangement, which engages in the function as a use of criminal abuse as an act of war in order to undermine the function, including the function of poisoning peoples, similar to the tactics of how they gave Hitler estrogen in order to decrease his masculinity, as the function of telling them that they don't have the right to their false convictions is the function of the tolerance of reducing their masculinity and testosterone by the poisonings of their estrogen and other attacks against sexuality in order to create the false identity of not being masculine is one of their primary arrangements, as they actively engage in the fraud disguised by the secret. The public observation of the thing is that the person has been victimized into the thing, except you remove the victimization part and you just have the story conducted, which generates the position of the false identity superimposed onto them by simulation struggling. And the communist struggling is the harassment into the position in order to make them the product. And in the use of struggling or harassing them into the product, it ends where they accept their place as the struggled thing, and they accept the identity by the government for the interest of the white supremacists as they validate and clean their hate crimes against the civilian population, which is a function of their cult practices, such as the function of the Jezebel arrangements, which acknowledges the obligation to engage in the creation of eunuchs and the removal of masculinity, especially as a function of payment in the deal with that particular devil, which is actively distributed, especially by the Christian nationalists. Uh, Label, which actively uses the fraudulent excuses of noncompliance with the pseudo Christianity controlled by the Druids as an obligation to be retaliated against, such as Mike Pence's position of gay conversion therapy, where the person is literally being abused into the position. Now, the function of them being assaulted and received these extreme injuries are designed to traumatize them against the natural reactions, whereas the natural reactions are reactions to the assaults. And so you have assault A, which creates the side effect, and assault B is designed to purify the side effect by making the person too embarrassed or afraid of admitting to what's happening to them, which protects the crime from being revealed, as the terrorists engaged in the hate crime arrangement are systemically trying to criminalize evidence and make people too afraid to reveal it, similar to how Jeffrey Epstein protected himself against his victims, revealing that Jeffrey Epstein was a pedophile by the function of abusing them, including the various poisons and harassments and subversions and underminings by the cover of the government without competent legitimacy, as the function is a subversion of the office and is not lawfully protected, as it is not a service of the United States government, does not have the protections of sovereign immunities, which is a degree of fraud as a subversion of the Declaration of Independence, which is legally signed by Congress, which is the arrangement of conducting all of the various abuses of the king which generated the United States, such as, but is not limited to, the function of creating the moving of the victim to various jurisdictions in order to find one to convict him under false pretenses, at which point him or her being targeted uh, are corralled by the slave raids into a false jury arrangements to specifically attack due process, similar to how is currently being reproduced as loyalty to the king in the past is the current unitary executive theory, that the function of the executive ignores all restrictions by the other branches. which defines the function of the obligation of the United States in its original forming through the Declaration of Independence, which is the founding principle, which is the assumed from the record time period of the start of David's branch of the military as intelligence oversight in the subversion and undermining of those operations, which generates his legal obligations in the undermining of those loyal to nobility against the function of the republic, and the complete collapse of the system in favor of these arbitrary insurrectionist operations. And one of the many weaknesses of the noble monarch being supreme is the function of plausible deniability being diversified into the hate group phantom cells, which are actively undermining it. As what happens when those phantom cells attack the president with all of the protections under the monarch's authority? The monarch's authority being turned against itself is a function of suicide at that point, and thus disproven from any rational position, and thus is a custom without reason in favor of total insurrection in the opposition of the system, including the function of the system at the highest levels, which it was designed to protect.